Today we're going to be playing kind of a what-if game, an alternate history, not as in Graham Hancock alternate history, just what could have been. Imagine a world where Christianity never became the dominant religion of the West, where the old gods of Greece and Rome still stood, where temples, not churches, shaped the skyline of Europe. It almost happened. It's the 4th century, and Julian, who will become known as Julian the Apostate, is the last pagan emperor of Rome, and he had seemingly a singular goal, which was to undo what Constantine had done, to roll back Christianity. He wanted to bring forth the old ways, the old traditions, the old gods, and reshape the empire. He wanted to make Rome great again. And I know my last video was purposely tied into what is going on in America today, but this one is just happenstance, and it's funny how you see the patterns of history. Julian felt that the new ideologies on the scene were disbeneficial, and he wanted to go back to when his country was great before, the traditions that they once proudly held on to. He revived this in the common folk and tried to make an enemy of the current belief systems that were going on. In fact, he even called Christians atheist because they did not believe in the gods that he did, and he treated these atheists poorly. And in doing so is probably the reason that Christianity after his death sprang back so hard. And we'll talk about that more here in a minute. His first act in office was to increase the government efficiency and cut unnecessary and ridiculous spending. Again, my goal was not to make this related, and I'm not even trying to make a political point here. The goal of this channel is to help people keep thinking. And we have a figure in history, though from an atheist perspective, we might want to agree with and say, oh, I wish that he had stopped Christianity from the reign that it had, because we can see some of the bad things that happened with Christianity. We also, though, don't know what the world would be like if it had gone the other direction. It might be amazing. It might have gone much worse. We simply don't know. And to act like we would know, to assign with whatever side we are on, is foolish. If anything, I think it's a good chance for us who consider ourselves to be free thinkers and critical thinkers to prove some impartiality. I think there's warnings here. I think there's interesting history here. I think there's an understanding of religious and political power and how they tie together. And one of my favorite things, I think we can just invite this thought experiment. What if? What if he had won? What if he had succeeded? And he was doing so. He was succeeding until essentially an accidental or untimely death. So let's get into this. We're going to do what we typically do when we look at people in history. We're going to go through who this man was, kind of setting the stage. We're going to look at what made him an apostate. He was raised Christian and was a Christian for many years. We'll talk about his Pagan Counter-Reformation. That's what it was. And I want to explain the word pagan here in just a second. We'll talk about his death and the Christian backlash, and then again, we'll kind of look at the what if of it all. So before we dive into Julian, I want to talk about this word pagan. Oftentimes, pagan has a very negative connotation, and that's how it was originally formed. I'm using it more in this historical context coming from the Christians who won and thus kind of shaped the history of it. So pagan or paganus in Latin means rural dweller, and it eventually took on that pejorative meaning. The Christians were the ones in the cities. It was those crazy farmers on the outskirts who still believed in Apollo and Zeus. So eventually anyone that wasn't a Christian or a Jew just became a pagan on the outside, a worshiper of the old gods, the false gods, similar to how heathen was used later for non-Christians. And in Julian's time, paganism isn't a recognized religion. It isn't just one religious concept. It's a collection of ancient polytheistic beliefs. So let's talk about Julian, the last pagan emperor of Rome. And a quote to begin, "The gods are not dead. It is only the hearts of men that have turned away from them." Something that I respect, generally speaking, if it does not cause harm, is true belief. I really don't care what you believe, as long as you actually believe it and you don't harm yourself or others in the process. And for any flaws that we're going to find in Julian today, he was zealous for his gods. This quote almost might seem like something written by a Christian today when looking at the deconversion that has been going on and is increasing. So by 361 CE, we have Christianity that has risen to the top ranks and has associated power within the government thanks to Constantine. This once religiously diverse landscape was changing and changing fast with the decades that followed Constantine's revival. Some pagan temples still stood, but Christianity had taken over the imperial court, the army, and the legal system. Now, Julian was born almost 30 years before this mark. He was the nephew of Constantine, but he was raised under very different circumstances. His family was massacred in a political purge, leaving him orphaned and isolated. So he becomes raised as a Christian, but secretly drawn to that ever so interesting Neoplatonic philosophy, as well as the old gods and the mysteries of the ancient world. He was intelligent, he was well-read, he was fiercely independent, had to be with his kind of an upbringing, a man who would shape his own destiny. I think the best way to frame him isn't Christianity versus paganism. It's what is the role that religion should play in society, in politics, in power. Where do we draw the lines? And when one religion claims to be the only religion, thus making it exclusive from the others, how should others react? I mean, there's so many things that we could kind of use this as a catalyst, a launching pad to think about or talk about. But let's get into the next few years of his life, the making of this apostate. Another quote for us here: "It is not enough to worship the gods in temples. One must live in accordance with their laws." Again, a true believer. Having received the best education in the royal courts, he was educated not just by Christians, of which he had been converted, or raised up in, indoctrinated, whatever you want to call it, but also in Athens, where at this time he's kind of getting the remnants, the leftovers of this dying world, the last of the pagan intellectualism. And as every Christian's worst fear, I think it's around his teenage years, it's kind of hard to declare. There's many different claims going on here. He is inducted into the Eleusinian Mysteries, a secretive pagan religious cult, only reinforcing his belief that is now springing about at this time, that Christianity was a corruption of Rome's tradition. Again, I feel the need to make a caveat at this point that I am neither glorifying nor demonizing this man. There's good and there's bad. There's lessons to be learned. It's interesting. And as always, with all history, we can apply it to today. You may say, well, you go harder when you critique Christians, but that's because Christianity makes a claim that history does not. And that is perfection. That is perfect knowledge. That is perfect truth. That is the objective morality. To counter that, to critique that, one must show that those things don't exist. I have no problem saying Julian was probably not a good man, or that Julian was not some altruistic, idealistic, perfect leader that simply wanted fairness and equality for all. His actions don't show that, but I don't depend on him for my salvation, nor do I need his words to be perfect in order to guarantee my eternal soul. And so, like I continue to say, we can just talk about history as it is. We can even be wrong. We can even be misled. We can even get contradicting sources because there is no perfect truth claim going on here. But getting back to it here, he hides his other belief system now. He understands that he needs to play the game for a while as a Christian, and he rises through the ranks pretty quickly here. Constantinus II appoints him Caesar. And really quick, many people who don't have a good understanding of Roman history think Caesar is the leader. Caesar is kind of the junior emperor. Augustus is the emperor. And again, right now, that's Constantinus II, an intolerant Christian ruler, appoints Julian to Gaul to deal with the barbaric Germanic invasion. Not much was expected out of Julian, but he surprised everybody. He was an incredible general. He had many, many fierce victories and secured the loyalty of his troops. So much so that in 360, we get what would become a potential civil war. His soldiers declared him Augustus, emperor. And we started to see some quick infighting between the two groups because, again, he wasn't well known in other parts of the empire, and Constantinus II still had a lot of support. But before this could turn into a total civil war or some kind of a coup or uprising, Constantinus II dies, leaving Julian as the sole emperor of Rome. And so all of a sudden, you have a pretend Christian with a deep love of the old Roman ways and the old Roman gods as emperor. Moving us to our next section here, this fight against the dominance of Christianity. Another quote: "I wish to recall the empire to its original purity and grandeur, not by force, but by persuasion." Now, I will say that that's nice. It's a nice quote, but he definitely used force, not military force, but almost anything short of that. And again, maybe there's something to be said here for the lessons that he had learned. Again, a very well-read and intelligent man, and he had seen both Christian rulers that had led by severe force and non-Christian rulers that had persecuted Christians, and he saw that neither worked out well. And so he came up with his own form of sabotage against Christianity and its influence in Rome. So he's emperor now, he rips off the mask, haha, I was just kidding, I am a pagan. And he did not outlaw any Christian activity, so to speak. He had a long game in mind. Let's call it a 3-part plan, though there were other intricacies that went into this. And by the way, like everything, I will list many of the resources and books that I think you might find interesting and useful in the description of the video. Part 1. Revive paganism. He ordered the rebuilding of temples. He funded the pagan priesthood and reestablished the official sacrifices. He created a structured pagan hierarchy, something to rival the organization within Christianity, perhaps. And he encouraged or pushed, depending on how you interpret it, the Neoplatonic ideals as a foundation for a more intellectual form of paganism. No denial of the old gods or their involvement. Just different ways of thinking about them. An elevation. You might compare this with how some New Testament writers had obviously been influenced by also Greek philosophy and brought it into their spiritual ideas. Think of Paul and Stoicism. You remove the Greek philosophy influences from Paul, and the Christianity we have today looks completely different. He also noted at this time that Christians were getting popular because of their welfare programs. And so he began to fund his own pagan welfare programs, beating them at their own game. Step 2, undermine Christianity. This first act, I think, is really interesting and one you could almost make your own episode about. He banned Christians from teaching the classics, what would have been considered the classics at that time, when it comes to literature or philosophy or science, effectively cutting them off from higher education. He encouraged infighting and kind of poked and prodded at individual Christian sects like the Nicene versus the Arian. He mocked Christianity, demoting it from something to be held so seriously or with reverence. This is again when you get the rewriting of history from the Christian victors in Rome. They'll point to this as Julian being a God-hater, being jealous of Christ and his influence, when, like most things, it's never so much that as it is calculated for power. He called Jesus a crude magician. When he gave better benefits to the pagans than the Christians, he mocked them, saying, "Don't you follow some Galilean homeless man? Surely you don't need property." Jesus was just some man who led foolish fishermen away. Again, there's a long list of things that we could cover for both step 1 and step 2, but we'll move on here. Step 3 of the 3-part plan is also very interesting, and this is the rebuilding of the Jewish temple. He effectively wanted to just shut down Christian prophecy to show that it wasn't true. And even Christians today still brag about how this went awry. And hey, it makes for a good story because the building plans are halted from some mysterious earthquake or fire, again, conflicting accounts, which Christians interpreted as God's intervention. Very hard when coincidence looks like fulfilled Christian prophecy to take that away from Christians. And again, Julian's reign also being cut short, so he never gets the chance to complete this particular tactic, only adds fuel to that fire. And again, all of this was working. There was revival in Rome, which leads us to the death of Julian the Apostate. And in wanting to give you a quote from Julian for all of these, we have, like Jesus, many different last words of Julian. Some say that he said, "The Galilean has won." But the most popular one is this: "The gods have abandoned us." But before his death, it is now 363 CE, he launches this ambitious military campaign in Persia, wanting to secure the borders. Rome had been lacking. They had pretty much just been trying to stop people at the border, sometimes taking some losses. And he says, no, we need to advance into Persia and set up a longer reign of peace. The campaign starts off very successfully, everything's looking good, but he overextends. He gets himself deep into Persian territory without all the proper resources. It leads to this chaotic retreat where Julian, without his armor, so the story goes, hurries into battle, and again, conflicting reports. Some say it's a stray arrow, some say a Persian spears him, some say that a Christian in his own ranks takes this opportunity to kill him, but he dies. And for some reason, one part of his plan wasn't to set up a non-Christian succession. Literally everybody in the succession plan was Christian. They quickly reversed everything that he had done and took his reign as a warning to never let this happen again. And so they push harder and they push farther. They eradicate more paganism. They make more rules. They set up more power for themselves. And so in this way, Julian's last attempts to take back Rome from the hands of the Christians might have been the very thing that caused its overreach that came next. Not that it wasn't overreaching before, but now we are full blown. And less than 30 years later, all pagan practices become completely banned, securing the fate of Rome's old gods. And I think there's something interesting to learn there. Oftentimes we talk about how silly it would be to see people worshiping Apollo or Zeus today, believing that there's some pantheon of gods in the sky concerning themselves with us. But it only seems ridiculous because it was stamped out. Religions have come and gone throughout history because there is no validity to them, and it is about what can be driven by power. This, I think, is a good learning point from this story. And this is what leads to the what if. What if Julian had 30 more years? Would Christianity have been stamped out in the same fashion? Would it seem just as crazy to us today as we walk into our temples thinking that to be completely normal, believing in our heart we are actually hearing from these gods, being guided by these gods, and reading in these little mythology books about the crazy ideas of the cult atheist past when people believed that some son of God and only one God, who was a carpenter, sacrificed himself to make a blood payment one time to defeat his adversary that was a fallen angel to free our souls from the damnation of hell. We'd probably have cute cartoons about it, the same way there's little Greek myth and Roman myth cartoons. We wouldn't be threatened by this at all because it would be so nonsensical. It would be so unserious to us. And all because of who was in power during very formative years of empire's reign. It's not absurd to think that another decade with Julian would have reshaped the face of the entire world. And again, for better or worse, we could not say, but it's interesting to think about. What would it be like to actually live in a polytheistic society? Would it have aided or suppressed further science and philosophy? Would it have simply replaced Christian dogma with pagan dogma? And I have my opinions. I think we can look at some of the things that had been accomplished by Greece and Rome under their polytheistic beliefs. I think we can look at the innovation in thought and in science and say that there's a good chance we wouldn't have had the Dark Ages. What would those extra centuries have done for us as a people? Would they have destroyed us, or would we be somewhere so completely different and better that we can't even fathom it? Christians can see rightly some of the influence of the Judeo-Christian belief system, if you will, in the Western society. I think they unfairly attribute that with anything good while denying anything bad from it. I can see both the good and bad from it, and I'm sure there would be both good and bad if things had gone the pagan way. But it is absolutely fascinating to me to think about, and it's one of those things you wish you could just peer into an alternate timeline and see how it would have gone. So, I would love to hear your thoughts on this episode. What do you make of Julian the Apostate? What do you make of his motives? Are they well-intentioned, or are they just more of what we all detest in the great power grab of history? And what are your answers to the what-ifs? Where do you think science and philosophy would be today? Do you think that the world would be more tolerant or less tolerant? Would religious freedoms be greater or diminished? Would Christianity have disappeared or just been some persecuted minority? Would the Roman Empire have lasted longer, or would this somehow cause it to be cut even shorter? How would Europe have looked? Would we still have had the Crusades? Would modern morality and ethics be any different? Would we still have ended up with Christianity anyways? Was Julian just fighting a losing battle from the beginning? Again, most Christians are going to say that because Christianity is a true religion, it was inevitable that it was always going to succeed. God willed it. But if that's true, I also would like to ask those people, what happens when it's not the majority anymore? Soon, probably in most of our lifetimes, Islam will take over as the prominent world religion. And maybe you can deal with Christianity being number 2, especially since number 1 is still an Abrahamic religion. You can just claim that there's so much work of the devil at hand. But what if the world goes on peacefully 3,000 years from now, and Christianity and Islam have faded into the past like the Greek and Roman myths? If you could know that, would you still claim that Christianity is the true religion? Again, endless fascination, but I'm going to cut it off here. Thank you so much for your time and attention today. I hope that you are finding these Thinking Thursday episodes interesting. Probably need to reframe how I've been talking about it. Kind of first approached it as, let's go through great thinkers in history. But I don't think that each of these are necessarily great thinkers. Of course, Epicurus and Hypatia, I would call that. But we've covered some men that definitely shouldn't be glorified, like King Ashurbanipal and now Julian the Apostate. We've also just looked at history in general and what we can learn from it, like when we covered the Salem witch trials. So if you've missed any of these episodes, please check them out. Please let me know how you would like to continue to see this series evolve. I'll see you Sunday with a new video, and until then, keep thinking. I wanted to personally thank my top tiers of support: my Iconoclast, Alexander, Ann, Boris, Eric, GVI, Joe, Kitboga, Matthew, Perry, and Sean; my Humanist heroes, James, Jared, Christy, and Thronus; my Atheist advocates, Caleb, David, Drew, Jeff, Jeffrey, Julie, Malcolm, Paul, Sparky, and Thomas; as well as all of my Secular Scholar patrons. If you believe in the mission of the channel or you just enjoy its content, please consider joining these fine people.